What is going on, everybody? It's official. The Princessin has returned to Genshin Impact banners on the Yai Miko banner, so I figured now would be a good time to update my dusty old Fischl guide with the newest and best info about the character. So today, I'm going to be talking about why Fischl is an amazing unit, how to build her, what team she can be played in, and more. As a heads up, we're only going to be talking about her sub DPS and support role, since that's the most effective way to play her, and honestly, if I added a physical Fischl to this video, it'd probably be over a half hour long. But do let me know if you'd be interested in a Fischl guide, and it may be something I make in the future. And with all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Fischl. Fischl has a lot of things about her kit that make her an amazing character. You can use her as an electro support or physical DPS, and she's good at both. I've always preferred her as an electro support, but her physical damage is still decent. And when Oz is on the field, Fischl becomes a strong battery for other characters, since Oz will generate an energy particle for roughly 60% of hits. Now that is a lot of energy. Fischl is also super easy to play as a supporting unit, since she barely requires any field time at all. But if you find yourself wondering who Oz is the bird that she summons with her elemental skill for about 10 seconds. On elemental skill cast, Oz will deal one area hit of damage and begin dealing damage over time to enemies. Now, one important thing to know about Oz is that the damage he deals after his initial cast is single target, meaning he's not going to be hitting every enemy at once. The one last thing I want to mention about her skill is that once Oz is down on the field, you can actually reposition it by using your elemental skill again, and it is possible to hold her elemental skill and choose the position of Oz, but I haven't found that to be super useful, except for in the overworld, where if you put him down on one of those tiles that highlights and spawns in a chest afterwards, you can actually use him for that, but outside of that, I haven't found a use for it. But now, if we talk about Fischl's elemental skill, it's actually very similar to Oz's burst. Fischl's elemental burst temporarily turns you into Oz and deals a hit of electro damage to any enemy you come into contact with. But do know that it can only deal damage to each enemy once, so after the first hit, it's not really worth staying in Oz form. With the animation for her burst being super long, most players just switch off of Fischl mid-cast of her burst, so that way you can shave off some of the burst time and you can still spawn Oz immediately. And that is because when you leave her burst form, Oz will just stay on the field for 10 seconds, just like her elemental skill, and continue to deal damage and generate energy. Her burst also does have iframes in it, which is just invincibility frames, just a couple frames where you are invincible and can't take any damage, and this is right at the start of the cast. But the issue with it is that it is a very short window, and it's a little different from your regular dodge iframes. It can be kind of hard to learn. That being said, though, if you do play a lot of Fischl, you'll probably learn how to dodge moves with it. Now, something that a lot of people don't know about Fischl is that Oz will actually snapshot buffs, and what this means is that basically if you're using a character that buffs stats like Bennett or Sarah, or someone that just buffs attack, for example, when you cast Fischl's skill or burst, Oz will maintain the stats that Fischl had at the time. Now, it is worth noting that the snapshot does take a second or so to actually happen, so if you switch towards the end of Bennett's burst, you might actually miss the buff, but in general, it's good to know that you can retain those stats. The snapshot happens whenever Oz is summoned, so whenever you use her burst and switch to another character to cancel the burst animation, a second or so after Oz comes out will be when the stats take effect. And also you can re-snapshot stats if you move Oz with Fischl's elemental skill that repositions him. Fischl's first Ascension talent allows you to shoot Oz with a fully charged shot to have him deal AoE damage. To be honest, this is a cool ability for Overworld, but typically you're not going to take the time to actually use it in high-end content that's time-based, so overall it's not a super useful Ascension. But her second Ascension passive is. It makes it so that if you cause an electro-related reaction while Oz is out with any character, Oz will deal bonus damage equal to 80% of Fischl's attack, and this is particularly good for electrocharge teams where you're going to be constantly proccing electrocharge. All of these things add up together to make Fischl deal high damage and also provide lots of energy for your team, and that's why she's absolutely insane to run in any sort of team that has electro-based units. So I want to take this time now to address artifacts next, because there's a lot of confusion from a lot of people on whether or not certain artifact sets are good for Fischl, so I'm going to be explaining which ones are the best for support and off-field damage Fischl, and you guys will be able to choose which sets you have available and which ones you want to run on your character. First off, before I get into the nitty-gritty of artifacts, it's important to know that if you're below AR 45, that it's not really worth going to farm for specific stats on artifacts. AR 45 is where you start getting guaranteed 5-star artifacts, and as a result, you want to make do with what you have until you can go all in on the 5 stars, otherwise you potentially risk wasting some resin, and you don't really want to do that because it is limited. If you're below AR 45, I recommend using 2 pieces of the Gambler set to make your Oz deal 20% more damage. Outside of that, anything with attack or crit rate like Sojourner, Gladiator, or Berserker will be fine for another 2-piece set. You honestly don't really need to be that picky below AR 45. This is just kinda if you want to get the most damage you can before you hit 45 and start farming. Those sets will definitely improve your damage. For stats, it can be hard to build crit below AR 45, and I always recommend building crit for DPS, but unless you have a crit weapon and can farm for artifacts, I would just recommend going all out on attack for your Sands, Goblet, and Circlet. If you have an electro damage Goblet at your AR, then that's great. You can actually use that over an attack Goblet, and you're going to see higher damage from Oz. But I cannot stress this enough, do not waste your fragile resin specifically on farming for artifacts. If you're going to spend resin, you can use your normal resin on it, but I would just highly recommend using resin on things like ley lines, ascension materials, boss materials, and then when you get to AR 45, you can truly start grinding out these sets that I'm about to talk about right now. For players who are above AR 45 and are farming currently, I'm going to recommend a fairly controversial set. And it may not actually be controversial to everyone, but a lot of people in the theory crafting community in particular don't really like this set. For players who use teams with many damage dealers or don't want to invest much into Fischl, Tenacity the Millilith can actually be very good since it's like a permanent noblesse buff when it's done right. The set works at any level with any stats, so for low investment, it's a solid deal. You're basically just getting plus 20% attack at all times when Fischl's elemental skill or just Oz in general is up. Now, the reason that people don't recommend Tenacity is because 1, it lowers Fischl's personal damage, and 2, not a ton of people farm that particular domain. But when you actually look at the mathematical values that Tenacity gives to many optimal Fischl teams, it ends up being worth it to build Tenacity. For example, any team that features Beto already wins out in overall team damage with Tenacity versus a combination of pieces like Thundering Fury and Gladiator on Fischl, as far as personal damage goes. In Eula teams as well, Tenacity ends up benefiting the team more. This is because you have lots of characters dealing damage at the same time, and you have a character like Eula who's very strong and deals more damage than Fischl, getting the attack buff. The only team that is well established where Tenacity won't benefit the entire team's damage output more than building Fischl for personal damage is Sukokumon, using Kokomi, Fischl, Xiangling, and Sucrose. And the reason for that is mostly because Kokomi already runs Tenacity in the team. Now, I'm not saying Tenacity is best in every team, but in most teams that you're running Fischl in, as long as they are built optimally, aka running Fischl with Beto, running Fischl with a hyper carry, etc., Tenacity will actually be a higher damage output. The set is just very strong in general, way more than people give it credit for. If you have a team with many characters that are dealing damage, Tenacity becomes a very strong resource for those characters to benefit from. Unless you have insanely good substat rolls on Shimenawa Thundering Fury or Thunder Soothers, a pretty mid set of Tenacity will be solid. I do want to note 2 things about Tenacity quickly before I talk to you guys about other sets though. First, because Fischl snapshots when summoning Oz, you'll miss out on the 20% attack increase until you either replace Oz or until you get back to Fischl for another Oz summon. Second, if you're using a team that has 2 supporting units that don't deal a lot of damage, Tenacity will lose out since it'll only be buffing Fischl and your other damage dealer. Now, if you don't want to farm a 4-piece set, or if you'd rather just play it safe and just make Fischl deal high damage, I'd recommend these sets instead. For a good general setup, I'd recommend 2-piece Thundering Fury and 2-piece Gladiator or Shimenawa. Thundering Fury is going to give you a 15% electro damage bonus, which will affect all of your Oz damage, and Gladiator Shimenawa will give Fischl an 18% attack bonus to further increase your damage. It's the set that I use, and it gets me solid damage. If you're looking for the absolute damage ceiling of Fischl, the highest damaging set's going to be 4-piece Thunder Soother. When you have the 4-piece set, Fischl's damage against enemies with Electro on them will be increased by 35%, which is just super strong for off-field damage. But there is one major problem with Thunder Soother though, and it's that it only really works in a mono Electro comp or an Electro Charged comp if you want to have the most consistent damage. The reason why is if you have other elements in the mix like Cryo or Pyro, you can end up removing the Electro Aura and not keeping the 35% damage bonus. On top of that, there's easier sets to farm for without conditions like Thunder Soother, so generally I wouldn't recommend it unless you're trying to max out an Electro Charge team. You also have the option of running 2 Gladiator, 2 Shimenawa for about 36% attack bonus, and it ends up being pretty solid as well. Now, it'll theoretically have the lowest damage of the other sets I already mentioned, but because these sets are already pretty common, you'll probably already have a good 2 and 2 set of these that you can run that might have better substats than the other sets I mentioned. Ultimately, any of the sets I mentioned above will be a solid choice, and at the end of the day, I would recommend picking the easiest one for you to build, since you all know how artifact farming can be. Don't waste too much resin if you don't have to. As far as stats go, you're going to want to go with an attack percent sans, an electro damage goblet, and a crit damage or crit rate circlet. Now, some players may be wondering about elemental mastery, since Oz will often be the trigger to elemental reactions, and generally speaking, I would advise against building an elemental mastery sans since you'll lose a lot of personal damage unless you have a ton of enemies grouped up for overload, and superconduct and electrocharge damage is pretty copium. On substats though, elemental mastery is really not that bad. Speaking of substats, you're going to want to prioritize crit rate and damage for Fischl's personal DPS, followed by attack percent and elemental mastery. What you're ideally shooting for is to have at least 50 crit rate and 100 crit damage by the end of your build. Now, if you can't make that happen, in a lot of cases building for attack percent is going to be better than a crit circlet, but in most cases where your character's focused on damage, it is worth farming out that crit piece for the circlet and trying to get crit substats so that way you can have a good ratio, just because crit ends up being so much stronger than attack. It is time to move on to weapons, where I'm going to suggest a bunch of weapons. Yep. In terms of damage, Polar Star at Refinement 1 is going to be the best damaging weapon for Fischl since it increases attack, skill, and burst damage. Now when you're using it, make sure to normal attack once before you summon Oz to try to get the extra stack of attack buff from its passive. Following that, Skyward Harp at Refinement 1 is very close since it gives crit damage and has a very high base attack. After those two 5-star weapons though, you're gonna have Alley Hunter, which is Fischl's best 4-star weapon. The reason it's so good is that it gives damage percent for being off field, which is better than attack for Fischl. The weapon passive itself is dynamic, meaning that though Fischl will snapshot any buffs at the time of summoning Oz, the weapon buff will still change and affect her damage. Alley Hunter is just a really solid choice, and at Refinement 5, as long as you're building crit still, it's barely behind Skyward Harp. Next up is Thundering Pulse. It's another good option if you happen to have that because it has very good stats and makes building crit easier. One other weapon that I want to mention as a super solid option for Fischl is Elegy for the End. Players will often underestimate Elegy on Fischl because it has an energy recharge main stat, which Fischl just doesn't really want. But Elegy's passive is super strong. It gives 100 elemental mastery and 20% attack to your team after a few hits of Oz. Since you can get stacks for Elegy while off the field, this weapon becomes super easy to use with Fischl, and even though it lowers Fischl's personal damage a little bit, the increase to your team's damage will be worth it if you don't have any of the weapons I mentioned already. In some cases, with many characters dealing high damage on your team, Elegy's buff can even beat out Fischl's personal damage increase with Polar Star. It is a really solid weapon, and I cannot fathom how people are sleeping on this weapon so hard. It's really just so good, you guys. Now, if you happen to have Stringless at Refinement 5, it is also very good if you're able to build crit. Most people don't like Stringless because it has an Elemental Mastery main stat, which will scuff Fischl's damage and make crit harder to build than with a crit weapon. But to be honest, EM isn't that bad of a main stat outside of Mono Electro since it'll buff reactions. But that is one major downside of the weapon for a lot of players. It is definitely worth using, especially if you have higher refinements, where its passive gives skill and burst damage an increase that is very high, about 48% at Refinement 5. It's very strong, especially if you can still build crit. Another solid weapon for Fischl is going to be Viridescent Hunt from the Battle Pass, just because it gives you crit and that's pretty helpful. Now, if you're free to play and you have the craftable Prototype Crescent, it can be pretty good with its passive, but the one major issue that I have with it is that you have to hit a headshot between summoning Oz, which can take up extra field time on a character you're going to be using off field. If you have any of the other weapons I mentioned, I would recommend them over Crescent, but Crescent can be pretty solid on Fischl if you don't have other options. Moon can also be decent, but it's less usable on other characters, so I just wouldn't put resources into it unless you've already got it leveled. The other weapons I mentioned are better. Lastly, I do want to mention Windbloom Ode, which was released very early on in the game's life cycle. If you do happen to have this weapon, it's actually decent on Fischl. Most of the weapons I talked about before will beat it out for damage, but it's a good free-to-play option that doesn't require you to craft something. Now, before I go on to the teams section, it's incredibly important to keep in mind that there are a ridiculous amount of weapons in this game, and I really just don't have the time to go into each one in depth, otherwise this video would be ungodly long. So if I didn't mention a weapon, it's not that I forgot the weapon, it's because all of the weapons I had listed are better than that weapon at the time of this video's release. Anyways, let's talk about Fischl teams because these are super important. So when we talk about Fischl, we have a lot of flexibility. Now that doesn't mean that every single Fischl team is going to be good, but Fischl can be slotted in with a bunch of different carries and still bring a lot of value to the table. Luckily for us, there are plenty of Fischl in the sea. The first team that I want to talk about is Sukokumon, a team that actually came up very recently as one of the top teams for recent Abyss cycles. Sukokumon stands for Sucrose Kokomi Pokemon, with the main Pokemon being Kokomi Jellyfish, Fischl's Oz, and Xiangling Squoba. This team could be argued as a variation of either National or Taser Comp, but the idea is is that there are so many reactions going on with the Viridescent debuff, as well as 2 extremely solid damage dealers that enemies sort of just melt. But not literally, because there's no cryo. Now, if you watched my Kokomi video, you might remember that I said Tsukokomon has a very specific rotation to it. This is still the case. If you want to maximize Tsukokomon damage, you'll need to follow a very specific rotation to get the elemental reactions to align correctly. That being said, this team is still really good if you don't follow the rotation. It just loses out on a decent chunk of damage without casting skills and bursts in the right order. The main reason I wanted to talk about Tsukokomon though is because it technically is one of Fischl's strongest teams. You have Kokomi with the Tenacity set and Thrilling Tales, meaning you could build Fischl for raw damage, and Sucrose gets to make the most out of Elemental Mastery with her kit. If you're not a fan of Tsukokomon though, there are plenty of other options. Outside of Tsukokomon, if you want to make a strong Fischl team, you can basically just follow this formula. Driver plus Beidou plus Fischl plus Flex. If you didn't know, Beidou has one of the best bursts in the entire game, but because her battery needs and lack of prevalence of Electro teams, she's not used very often. But essentially, if you run Fischl in any team, you can also slot Beidou in super easily, since Fischl will take care of Beidou's battery. A driver in this case is a character that attacks fast to activate Fischl and Beidou damage when they're off field, and the flex is usually to buff your team or debuff enemies. For example, this team uses Child, Beidou, Fischl, and a flex character. The flex can be either an Animo Swirler, Albedo, or Bennett. I personally like to use Jean here since she can use Viridescent Venerer and provide heals for the team, and using her also frees up Bennett for the other team. That being said, usually using Bennett will get you the best damage since it'll allow you to vaporize with Child's burst and snapshot attack buffs onto Fischl and Beidou. One thing to note about this team is that it really excels in fights with lots of enemies since Child has Riptide, Beidou's burst does tons of area damage, and Electrocharge can stun enemies to stop them from moving too far away. But in single target, Beidou's burst and Child's Riptide become much less strong since you can't chain the abilities off of multiple enemies. If you want to compensate for the single target damage loss though, you can replace Child with Yoimiya for overloads. Yoimiya drives Beidou and Fischl very well, and while most pyro carries don't like overload because it knocks enemies away, Yoimiya is a ranged character who can still hit enemies when they get overloaded, at least whenever she decides to shoot with her eyes open. And because of Singchul's Hydra application, you can vaporize on top of overloads for massive damage. Now the third team that I want to show you guys is going to be a fairly free-to-play friendly team. It's going to be Sucrose, Fischl, Beidou, and Singchul, and this is called Taser. As mentioned before, Sucrose is really solid for debuffing enemies, and because Sucrose is a Catalyst user, as mentioned before, she can give you a huge attack bonus on the character you switch to from Sucrose, and if you switch to Beidou, she can maintain that attack buff through the entirety of her burst, so it ends up being a super strong combination. This team is super solid. I love this team. It's super free-to-play accessible since it's all 4 stars, and I'd highly recommend using it if you have the option. And now I want to talk about the fourth team. This team is going to be a Eula Superconduct team. Following the DPS Fischl Beidou flex mentality, Eula is actually an amazing pairing with Fischl. When you apply Electro to someone who has Cryo on them or vice versa, you cause a Superconduct that lowers their physical resistance, and this will make your Eula stronger. The flex can be a Swirler for Beidou and Fischl damage or Diona for heals and a shield. Jean is a great pick here for a bit of extra damage, heals, and swirl as well. And also, since the Clam set was released, Chi-Chi can fit in this team well as a healer since she'll constantly deal extra physical damage while healing you from the Clam's 4-piece passive. If you wanted to, you could hypothetically run Crescent Pike Zhongli in place of Eula for a decent physical carry as well. The idea is just exploiting Superconduct while also buffing your team. Now, one last thing I want to say about Fischl in terms of teams is that in general, she's just a great battery, so you can replace characters with high cost bursts for others. For example, Yaimiko and Beidou are pretty interchangeable. In most teams, Beidou's going to deal more damage, but if you want to play Yai, then you can just swap her in for Beidou and vice versa. You can also swap in Sara to buff Fischl since she'll snapshot attack, but just know that she will not snapshot Sara's C6 bonus. But overall, these are some of the team options you have. I'd highly recommend trying some of these out if you haven't already. They all feel great to play, except for Tsukokomon because that one's kind of hard, but with invested characters, you can basically 36-star Abyss with any of these teams. So I wanted to add this next section into this video because a lot of people are talking about the viability of Fischl when you have Raiden. Not together, of course, but is it worth pulling for Raiden if you have C6 Fischl? Or is C6 Fischl going to be doing the exact same functions as Raiden? So real quick, I just want to clear some things up. With their elemental skills, Fischl and Raiden both generate energy at the same rate. About 66% of hits will generate a particle. In single target scenarios, below Constellation 6, Fischl will get out damaged by Raiden by a little bit. But at Constellation 6, Fischl's damage potential is actually higher than a Constellation 0 Raiden. That being said, Fischl's damage is single target only, whereas Raiden's abilities all deal area damage that can hit multiple enemies, making C0 Raiden's damage potential significantly higher than Fischl's in multi-target combat. On top of that, Raiden's burst generates extra energy for your whole team, whereas Fischl doesn't have that capability. In that way, we can conclude that a Constellation 0 Raiden is better than a Constellation 6 Fischl in most scenarios. That being said, Fischl is an absurdly good unit still. It's just worth noting that Raiden is definitely an upgrade at the end of the day. So before I give you the final verdict on Fischl, I want to quickly talk about her constellations. Fischl is already an amazing unit at Constellation 0 for her damage and battery capabilities, but she gets a lot better with constellations as well. Constellation 1 makes it so that when Oz isn't summoned, if Fischl normal attacks, Oz will create a second instance of damage based on 22% of Fischl's attack stat. It is worth noting that Oz must be off the field for this to work, and for that reason, it's basically only useful in a physical damage build. Constellation 2 buffs Fischl's elemental skill and makes it deal an extra 200% of Fischl's attack as damage on cast, and increases the size of its area damage by 50%, which makes it more convenient to use against multiple enemies and just adds a little bit of damage. Constellation 3 increases her skill level by 3, which in turn increases Oz damage when he's left on the field. This one's a pretty good one to have. Constellation 4 makes Fischl deal bonus damage in an area whenever she uses her burst. The damage comes out right after her burst is activated, so you can still get the damage in and swap off the character. Also, when the burst ends, Fischl will restore 20% of her health. Constellation 5 is another damage increase by leveling her burst by 3, and Constellation 6 is, well, for the lack of a better term, the broken one. It extends the duration of Oz by 2 seconds whenever he's on the field. This is the constellation that makes it so when you attack with Oz present, you deal extra damage. It applies to your active character, but takes 30% of Fischl's attack to deal electro damage. Overall, this constellation raises Fischl's damage ceiling by a bunch and is also part of the reason she's so strong in taser setups. Generally speaking, most of Fischl's constellations are good, but once you get to Constellation 6, she just turns into even more of a powerhouse. Now, if you're at Constellation 0, you shouldn't pull on a banner just to get constellations for her unless she's on a character banner that you like, but as stated in my banner review video, if you've seen that, I think that having just one Fischl is a massive improvement to any account. Fischl is an incredibly powerful unit who can offer a lot to your team. She's a high damaging electro unit who's super easy to use, doesn't require a lot of field time at all, and generates a ton of energy. She doesn't need any gacha weapons to be strong, and she has a lot of flexibility with her artifact sets too. On top of all that, she has a lot of free-to-play friendly team options that could be considered top teams like Taser, for example. Being able to enable electro units like Beidou and Yai makes her very valuable, and all of these perks are for a 4-star unit. Many players haven't used Fischl in a while since Raiden's release, but she hasn't changed how useful she is at all, even with the shift in enemies in Abyss. Her coming back on Miko's banner is huge for players who never saw the chance to get her, because you have access to a cheap to build 4-star unit who can bring absurdly high value to your teams. I highly recommend building Fischl, especially if you don't have Raiden or are planning on using Beidou, but more than that, I think that she's going to be relevant for most of Genshin Impact's lifespan. Anyways, that's about it, guys. If you've enjoyed the video or if this has been helpful to you, think about leaving a like or subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out and helps me gauge if you guys like the content, and it also lets YouTube know that you like the video. Good luck on your banner polls, everyone, and I will catch you next time.